Hendrik, you, Frost and Sullivan are at the forefront of marketing Africa and getting investors to really think again about the sort of risk perception of investing in Africa. And I know that very, very recently, you have been having a focus on agro-industrial parks. Can you share with us your sense of perhaps investor appetite for supporting agro-industrial parks across the continent, the sort of sentiments that you're getting, and perhaps for people like Ibrahim, CEOs of investment promotion agencies who are trying to attract this investment. And I know that we have investment promotion agencies from across the continent. I've seen our friends from Zimbabwe Infrastructure Development Authority. I've seen colleagues from South Africa, from Kenya and Botswana. So I don't want to make this just about one country, because this is a Pan-African conversation. So if you can give us a sense of the investor appetite across the continent and some of the things that project sponsors and promoters need to really bear in mind if they're going to make serious traction in terms of attracting investment. Over to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Gori. And thanks for the opportunity to join the panel today. So I guess I need to start off by saying that we do a very substantial amount of work across sub-Saharan Africa, East Africa, West Africa, Southern Africa, even Central Africa to a degree. And our colleagues in the Middle East handle our North African operation as well. So what I'm going to sort of talk about, I think just now, is really based on broad inputs from investors from within the region, from outside of the region, the financial institutions that are operating at a global scale, especially sort of the larger scale ones that we quite often interact with. And I think to answer your question in first in summary format, I mean, broadly speaking, when we talk to financiers and potential investors, the first thing that typically gets raised is the governance issue, for capital investment in Africa. The governance structures, and I'm generalizing here just across the region, so I do apologize. I don't want to offend anybody in particular, but as a rule, our governance structures aren't strong enough in order to be able to receive large-scale capital. As a friend of mine always says, it's speed at scale. So the governance structures are very much something that public sector can drive. We've heard, I think, from the other speakers as well, that there is no chance that we can be able to develop the agricultural industry based on public sector capital, which I wholeheartedly agree with. The vast majority of governments across the region do not have, strong balance sheets. So their ability to drive large-scale infrastructure is limited, but they can create a better enabling environment, in order to be able to receive larger, sums of capital, both from an investment perspective, but then also from a financing perspective. And the second big issue, and I'm going to drop into a bit more detail in a minute, but the second issue is really the risk-return ratio of a large proportion of our projects in Africa. Quite often, we hear from some of the global investors and financiers that there aren't enough projects in Africa, but that's actually factually incorrect. We've got plenty of projects. We've got billions and billions of dollars of projects across the various types of investments, that potential international investors and financiers can get access to, but the majority of them don't meet the risk-reward criteria. That obviously gets determined based on base country, or from wherever the finance institution or the development finance institution, speaking more specifically, sort of originates from. And then thirdly, are things that we quite run in, regularly, is the scale of African agriculture. If you move north of the South African border and sort of out of the main economies in Africa, the scale of agricultural operations, it's just not big enough, in order to be able to interest some of the large investors. There's a significant amount of investment coming in from the Middle East at the moment, but they're looking for projects with scale, the ability to provide very large volumes, of produce, into the Middle East, not just on the fruit and vegetable side, but very much so on the meat side, especially so that you can create processing facilities that are halal, etc. So, with that in mind, I mean, there are a couple of things that we've seen, that deter investors or that attract investors, obviously depending on how you look at it. And apart from sort of the normal macro components, that's been spoken about up to this point, and that everybody is aware of, one of the key things in Africa is land ownership and land use. The majority of our deeds offices around the continent are pretty much dysfunctional. So the ability to prove ownership of a piece of property is quite challenging, which means that you can't loan against that property. You won't invest any large scale capital in a property where land use and land ownership is not secure. And we've seen where countries like Rwanda and a number of other sort of countries have started addressing sort of the land ownership and land use components, how big a difference it's made, from an investor perspective and from an investment perspective. Logistics infrastructure. We've heard, and again, I agree with the piecemeal approach, the intention of creating clusters, focusing on particular commodities where we have a competitive advantage. One of the key challenges that we keep on running into is logistics infrastructure. It's the ability to get the product out. Now, these agro-processing zones, will definitely help with reducing the level of perishability. But there are certain types of produce that you will not be able to process up into a point where you can use bad quality roads. You don't have the requirement for temperature controlled logistics. Those components, those baseline elements, need to be put in place. Agriculture is one of those industries that you cannot take a separate or an isolated value chain approach to developing the broader industry. You have to do an integrated approach, or take an integrated approach to develop the agricultural sector. And that means we need to address logistics, we need to address cold storage, we need to address the processing components, and very importantly, we need to address the production component, which needs to be more consistent in its quality, very importantly, and also the quantity. There's a tendency of trying to work with small farmer models, outgrower models, in order to supply agro-processing facilities and make sure that the logistic infrastructure is utilized effectively and sufficiently. But that's very challenging if you're working off outgrower models and smaller scale farming. It needs to be complemented with larger scale, commercial scale agriculture that can bring in good practices, can bring in additional infrastructure, know-how, that have the ability, to source the right kind of raw materials, whether it be sort of capital equipment on the one side, but very importantly also the right kind of seed, the right kind of feedstock, and varieties that we need for the African environment, which obviously from a production perspective is very limited. And then, the skills, one of the key things that investors always look at is, are there enough skills available in order to enable their investment to scale? And we've got we've got a bit of a challenge in Africa where there's a very strong fixation on university level qualifications, which has its place in all shapes and forms, but we need to focus more on vocational training, practical training, and very importantly also commercial training, so entrepreneurship. Structural job creation in Africa is only going to bring us that far. We need to focus on the entrepreneurial skills and capabilities which come natural to the vast majority of the African nations in order to be able to address some of these components. So let me stop there and then sort of hand over to you, before we get into too much detail.